Hello, this is a stream of theming from the ground up. This is actually an adaptation of a presentation I did at Drupal North in Toronto in June of 2015. So I've made some changes and improvements since then, and we're actually just going to do the first half today. And then I'm hoping to have 2 more sessions on theming from the very beginning. So this is kind of under the assumption that you don't know anything about Drupal 8 theming, you don't even know anything about Drupal 7 theming, and I also kind of had the intention of thinking about maybe people who might be coming from a WordPress background or from other content management systems that work completely differently. So this is about me. My name is Megan McDermott, and I've been doing web development for very close to 20 years now, which seems like a very, very long time. I've been working with Drupal since 2007. That was around the time Drupal 6 first came out. I'm a front-end specialist. I do a little bit of design, UX, and mostly front-end development. And there's a couple links there, and maybe we can post the slides after this somewhere on YouTube, and you can click on those links to find out a little bit more about me. Our company is Woolwich WebWorks, and we're a small but capable web development company located in Waterloo, Ontario. Okay, so theming from the ground up. This is hopefully going to be a 3-part series. Today is part 1. We're going to look at the structure of a Drupal theme, an introduction to Drupal theming from the very beginning, and how we create a really basic theme structure and get started. So next time I'm presenting, which will probably be in 2 weeks from today, we'll go over templating using Twig, creating template suggestions for overriding HTML output and modifying them using the Twig templating language. And part 3, which will be 4 weeks from today, I think that's April 7th, will be writing preprocess functions, which is a concept that sounds really confusing, but if you come to part 3 of theming from the ground up, you will hopefully understand what they are and how to use them. So what's a theme anyway? And theming is a concept that comes with a lot of different content management systems, and I find that words like theme and template can be very confusing terms because people use them in completely different ways. So the theme is a collection of code that creates the layout and design for a website. It defines where the content can be placed, the layout and regions in Drupal, and it's more than a template. It's a design system for your site. And if you look at something like Bartik, which was really carefully designed to accommodate a really wide range of different situations, it has lots of different regions. You can see in the screenshot here that there are these little tabs and there's sidebars, and Bartik has all kinds of different regions. So, when you're designing a theme for a particular client, you still need to keep that in mind, what they might want to do with it in the future, how you accommodate different kind of uses and placements of content. So there's different types of themes. There's a generic theme, which is like Bartik, so it's designed to be used for a lot of different situations and is kind of abstracted from what the particular topic or brand of the site is. There's a custom theme, and this is a screenshot of a theme for Drupal North from 2015. So that's a theme that was created for a specific site, a specific set of content, a specific layout. So it doesn't need to be as flexible as something like Bartik. And then on the right, we see a base theme. And a base theme is really minimalist. It's designed to be used as a starting point for a custom theme, and it includes little or no visual design at all. So you can see a screenshot there. That's what happens if you use Drupal 8's classy theme. You see just plain text on the page. So what makes Drupal themes unique or maybe different from especially something like WordPress? So the template system minimizes repetition and maximizes reuse. So we want to kind of abstract. The templating system is designed to abstract kind of the HTML markup from the specific context where it might be placed, for example. We have this concept of blocks and regions. So the page layout is divided into regions or sections where site builders can place a block using the Drupal's block user interface. And if you've used Drupal at all, you know what that page looks like. The theme defines which regions are available. We'll look at that in a few minutes. The theme is presentation only. It doesn't include any content or functionality. In Drupal 8, there's no PHP code in the template files, so it doesn't even work. So we really want to make sure that the theme is just taking care of the presentation layer, the design, any kind of behaviors using JavaScript, templating, HTML markup. But there's no content in there. Any content should be editable through the user interface, and no PHP functionality. We're not going to use this to create any new content structures or anything like that. And you can't edit theme files through an admin panel. I know there's some content management systems that let you do that, but in Drupal world, we consider that to be a security problem. So you can't do that. You have to use an appropriate method, like, managing their code through version control would be the best way to handle that. So theming in Drupal 8, all the templates have been converted to HTML5. That was a big initiative for Drupal 8. Another main principle is that we only include the CSS and JavaScript you need. And that was something that was a big push for restructuring theming in Drupal 8, was to make sure that themers could control which CSS and which JavaScript is actually being loaded and rendered. And if you have experience with, using third-party libraries, for example, you might have a really hard time trying to override, say, Colorbox is a common one, for example. It loads all kinds of CSS, and if you want to change that, it can be difficult to do. So in Drupal, we want to make sure that we can, say, unset that Colorbox CSS library, CSS file. And we'll look at a couple more examples of that in a few minutes. And another main point is getting off the island, which getting should be spelled correctly here. So Drupal is, in Drupal 8, trying to work towards using more different libraries and methods and standards that aren't just used in Drupal world. So that's where a lot of these big changes come from. For example, YAML is a markup language used for metadata, and that's where all of Drupal's info files and other metadata files are going to be using YAML. And we're also going to be using Twig for templating, which we'll get to more in part 2 of this series. And you can see the documentation link there, so that will tell you more. If you want to know more about any of this in detail, that's where all the Drupal documentation is for Drupal 8 theming. So the first thing you want to think about when you're creating a new theme in Drupal is to decide what you're going to base this on. And Drupal has this concept of sub-themes. And you can nest them as many times as you like, but usually you're going to base your theme on some starting point of markup. And in Drupal 8, there's 2 choices. There's classy and the other one is stark. So where was stark? The Drupal 7. So we're going to go into the core themes file. Oh yeah, yes, it's still called stark. So stark is a default. The default base theme is stark. If you don't specify a base theme, it's going to use the markup from stark. And we can poke around in this file. What's in here? Well, there's not very much, because all of the HTML template files it's going to pull from are part of core. So if we poke around in core, we can find out, let's see, here's the core folder. Go into modules. Let's see, where is Node? It's a pretty basic one. Node has templates. Here's the default templates that Drupal is going to use. So your base theme is a starting point. It's going to be all the markup and the HTML templates that your theme is going to be using by default. It'll inherit all the files, libraries, theme functions from the base theme. Of course, Drupal 8 has structured things so that you can change that if you don't want those libraries to be loaded or something like that. By default, so using the Stark theme by default, Drupal 8 uses no extra classes or IDs or attributes or anything. So if you just want to start from scratch, you want to write all of your own CSS classes, you want to put them all into the template files yourself, you can do that. Choose Stark for your, or no base theme. Classy was a base theme that was developed specifically for Drupal 8, and it has classes added everywhere you might need them in every template that Drupal provides. And they're based on the BEM or SMAX and SMAX method of structuring CSS classes, and you can Google those if you want to know more. In Drupal 7, and at the time of the original presentation, this was true. In Drupal 8, there's a lot more base themes being developed all the time, and they all do different things. The one caution I'd have about choosing a base theme is to make sure you understand why you're choosing it and why you're using it. So a lot of the times you'll come across advice about someone who says, oh, just use the Omega theme. It's great. It'll help you a lot. It provides a lot more sensible markup. But you kind of have to understand why you're using it and what benefits it's providing. I've come across a lot of sites that seem to have just picked a base theme because someone told them it was the best one and then proceeded to completely ignore what it was doing. So some of these can be pretty complicated. It's not so much the case anymore in Drupal 8, but if anytime you're choosing a module or a theme, you have to understand why you're doing it and don't just do it because someone else says it's a good idea. So the structure of a Drupal 8 theme. We're getting a little bit more of a plant growing here. So here's the basic structure of a Drupal theme, and this is a screenshot of the folder from Bartik. And you will find that some of these core themes have some folders that you don't necessarily need if you're creating your own theme. But every theme you'll see will have an info file, and you can see Bartik's right here, bartik.info.yaml. All of our metadata files have the .yaml extension here. We have a libraries file that includes all your CSS and JavaScript, and we'll talk more in a few minutes about what is actually a library and why are we doing it that way. Bartik has a Breaktpoints file, and again, I'll explain a little bit more what that is. It's really optional, and you don't really need it unless you're actually implementing a module that needs it. We have a folder for template files, and any template files that you specify will override whatever came from your base theme. So next time, we'll go into a little bit more detail about how that works, how to specify a template file. And we have a .theme file, and .theme file includes all your logic and preprocessed functions, which we'll talk about in part 3 of this series. And we have a logo by default and a screenshot, which will appear in Drupal's admin interface. So the custom themes will always live in the themes folder right off of your Drupal root. And this is one of the big changes that happened in Drupal 8 is to restructure things so it makes sense that you just put your themes in the themes folder, and there's not, you're not likely to put it in the folder that's actually meant for the core themes. So the recommended file structure, you have your CSS, your JavaScript, images, and templates. Of course, you're free to do that however you want. This is a common structure that's becoming pretty ubiquitous, I think. And if you're working on anything that other people might use in the future, it's always good to kind of follow conventions as much as you can. You can see that Bartik also has a folder for config. So these are the theme settings that you'll find in the Drupal admin interface. And for custom themes, you probably don't need to do this, and you can ignore it. If you're doing a theme that requires site builders or anyone who's using it to be able to change settings, that's how you set that up. And Bartik also has a color module folder. So if you, for some reason, want to implement color module, then that's where all the code for that goes. And maybe eventually I will do a session on that because color module is a little bit esoteric and difficult to understand if you haven't done it before. So the info file. The info file provides information to Drupal about your theme. So the name, the type of theme, the description, the version, this is all the information that appears on the appearance page in Drupal's admin. It specifies which base theme you're using, which libraries you're providing, and which regions you want to provide for the blocks to be placed in. Now, one thing that might be a little bit confusing to people new to Drupal is this concept of a machine name. So a machine name is a code name that Drupal uses internally to identify your theme and do various things with it. So this is something that must be all lowercase. It has to have no special characters except for underscores. And you have to make sure that it's the same when you're using it to make your folder for your theme, make the names for your info file, libraries file, and your .theme file. and then you would also use it when you're writing pre-processed functions. So if you're having a problem with your new theme not appearing in the Drupal admin interface, or there's errors when you enable it, that might be why. You have to make sure that they're all the same. The info uses the .yaml syntax, and there's a link to the documentation there as well, which would work better if you could actually see these slides when I'm finished. So what's YAML? YAML is a human-friendly data serialization standard for all programming languages. You can go to yaml.org to see some more examples and use cases in different programming languages. Here's an example. This is from the Waterloo theme, which is a contrib theme that I developed a few years ago. So we see the name of the theme. The type is a theme, not a module. So we kind of have a lot of commonalities between the information that we provide for a theme or a module. The info file is used in the same way. So a module could define a library just the same way as a theme has. So that's why we need to say that the type is a theme. The base theme for Waterloo is classy. We have a description. A package. Now this package and version and core, you really only need if you're contributing a package to Drupal.org. If you're doing a custom theme, you don't need those lines. And we'll see in a few minutes when we actually do a demo of that we don't really need to put those in there. Libraries. Now we're defining two libraries here, a global styling and a slideshow. So the libraries are all packaged up CSS and JavaScript that you're using for a certain situation. And every site's probably going to have a global styling, and this is stuff you're going to use across this whole site. I also find that, if you have code that's running that you really only need in certain parts of the site, you can abstract it into its own library. So for example, I have this Waterloo slideshow. This is something that's loading a bunch of CSS and JavaScript that you might not need or want. People using the theme might want to unset it in their own sub-theme. So we make it possible for them to do that by putting it into a separate library. And then we have the regions. Header, menu, featured content. The content region is required. So if you have a problem with your theme not enabling or installing, or it's not appearing in the appearance screen, make sure you have a content region. We have a sidebar and 2 footer sections for this theme. And of course, it all depends on what you are implementing. These regions are never set in stone. You can always go back and add more, change them, remove them, rename them, anything. Of course, that might have repercussions for any blocks you've placed, but just keep that in mind. If you decide to rename a region, your blocks are all going to disappear. I mean, they're not going to disappear. They're going to be reset, unset, and disabled, and you'll have to replace them. So a couple tips for the info file. In YAML, the spacing is really important and the syntax. So again, if your theme is not appearing on the appearance screen, if it won't enable or you're getting errors, then there might be some syntax errors in your YAML. And you better double check that and make sure everything is correct. You have to include a content region. Everything else is optional. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about libraries, and hopefully this will make a little bit more sense. So you have a libraries file at yourtheme.libraries.yaml. At first I thought this seemed like a lot of extra work. I can't just put my CSS files in. I have to make this whole libraries thing, and the syntax is really intricate, and you have to make sure it's right, and it seemed like a pain in the butt. But now it really makes sense to me. I had another example where I really wanted a certain piece of JavaScript to just run when users were not logged in. So this client had this chat applet, which they found that really helped drive business, but it was really annoying when it kept popping up while I was working on the site. So I put that in a separate library, wrote some code in my preprocess function to only run that when the user was not logged in. So I made that library only run in certain situations. So it allows you to have a lot more control over what code is actually running and when. I usually find that you can abstract things in different libraries and control when they're loading, but if you've got a 500 line CSS file, then it's going to be aggregated anyway. And going to the effort of creating another library and controlling when it's running might not be necessary. But if you have some much more complex functionality, it's loading some third-party scripts that might be really big, then you might want to separate that out into a separate library, like I did it with the Waterloo slideshow library, and make sure that's only going to load in situations where it's needed. So the libraries are going to separate your presentation into different groups. And that means you can also remove libraries provided by base themes or modules. And when we get into a little bit more advanced usage, you can see how you can use the info file to unset libraries that came from third-party modules and things like that, and really control exactly what is being loaded. So here's a libraries file. Here's my Waterloo libraries. We have the global styling. It has some CSS files loaded by the theme. And you can see, you can specify as many CSS files as you want. These little squirrely brackets here are where your media queries can go. So here's my print CSS file. I just want it to run in media print. I can use a media query here if I wanted to. Normally you don't do responsive CSS this way anymore, but at the time that this theme was developed, we did. That's just an example of what can go in the squirrely brackets there. And then here's a second library, the Waterloo slideshow library. It's loading some different things. One thing you need to do is that if you require jQuery, you need to specify it. So these JavaScripts here that are loading the slideshow, they depend on jQuery. So I need to list that as a dependency. Otherwise, jQuery it's not going to load, which is good. You don't want it to be loading if you don't need it. Breakpoints file. Now, this is something that's really confusing, and it took me a while to understand what was going on. If you look at the documentation on Drupal.org, it's really confusing and technical, and it's not really clear what this is actually for. So the breakpoints file is not used for responsive CSS. You don't need to tie into it for your responsive layouts or your CSS coding at all. It's only used for modules that need to make changes based on breakpoints. And a common example would be responsive images. So those modules will require you to have a breakpoints file in your theme, and then it will respond based on those breakpoints. But you don't need to worry about this if you're not using a module that requires it. So we're just going to ignore it for right now. If you decide to implement a module that requires breakpoints, then you can come back to the documentation about breakpoints and implement that in your theme. Or look at Bartik for an example. Bartik has breakpoints implemented. So let's make a theme.